Back at it again with the Mobius chapter 46, Surmises. So this is a short chapter, but I think it presents an interesting question. And let's dive into that question on the second page here. The passage says, not only that, but the subtle insanity of Ahab respecting Moby Dick was no ways more significantly manifested than in his superlative sense and shrewdness in foreseeing that for the present the hunt should in some way be stripped of that strange imaginative impiousness which naturally invested it, that the full terror of the voyage must be kept withdrawn into the obscure background, for few men's courage is proof against protracted meditation unrelieved by action, that when they stood their long night watches, his officers and men must have some nearer things to think of than Moby Dick. For however eagerly and impetuously the savage crew had hailed the announcement of his quest, yet all sailors of all sorts are more or less capricious and unreliable. They live in the varying outer weather, and they inhale its fickleness, and when retained for any object remote or blank in the pursuit, however promissory of life and passion in the end, it is above all things requisite that temporary interest and employment should intervene and hold them healthily suspended for the final dash. So I think the central idea of this chapter, which is explored, I think, primarily in that passage, is what is mankind made for? Are we creatures who are predisposed towards the earthly or the spiritual? The spiritual and the transcendent, which would constitute this consideration of the big ideas that Moby Dick has come to represent in chapter 42 and chapter 36? Or are we more made for the everyday quotidian kind of give me my, as Dostoevsky would say, my little pleasures throughout the day? You know, are we more made for watching a fun movie or going on a run than thinking really hard? And I think this is a matter of opinion. I think some people, when it comes to interesting philosophical questions, would say that that is the bulk of one's life. Like Socrates said, right? The unexamined life is not worth living. But then again, it seems that if literature and philosophy are awesome, that without the daily routine and normalcy that grounds a person who's studying those things, it starts to lose its hold. Or maybe rather than lose its hold, starts to gain too strong a hold. That perhaps without the balance of the earthly, the spiritual can become too overwhelming for the average person. I'm not sure if this is a critique of mankind, i.e. we're not worthy of constant pursuit of knowledge or of ideal things, or whether it's less a critique and more a celebration of the importance of balance. I think it can be read either way. But obviously, those ideas explain why the next example is the Crusaders. In times of strong emotion, mankind disdain all base considerations, but such times are evanescent, which is a word that means soon passing out of sight, quickly fading. So there are times when mankind is interested in ideas, but those times are very short. The permanent constitutional condition of the manufactured man, thought Ahab, is sordidness. Sordidness meaning basically immoral or ignobleness. Granting that the white whale fully incites the hearts of this my savage crew, and playing round their savageness even breeds a certain generous knight-errantism in them, which means like a willingness to go on a mission, and obviously that mission is hunting Moby Dick. Still, while the love of it they give chase to Moby Dick, they must also have food for their common daily appetites. For even the high-lifted and chivalric crusaders of old times were not content to traverse 2,000 miles of land to fight for their holy sepulchre without committing burglaries, picking pockets, and gaining other pious perquisites, by the way, which I thought was a misspelling of prerequisites, but turns out is actually just an archaic way to talk about perks. Had they been strictly held to their one final and romantic object, that final and romantic object, too many would have turned from it in disgust. So obviously, the Crusaders are an example of some people who have theoretically a very noble goal in mind, at least a spiritual goal in mind. Certainly for the 11th to 13th centuries, it was considered noble. I'm not sure how the viewer in 2020 would use this example, but nevertheless, assume that the Crusades had a good end. What Melville seems to be saying is that no matter how noble the end goal is or how abstract the end goal is, human beings need that grounding in normalcy and in the concrete in order to operate in a balanced or effective manner. I think that's somewhat true. I mean, obviously, routines and habits and being grounded is important. But I also think that the fun, or at least the diversity of life, comes from the fact that there's such a wide distribution of people on this spectrum between the interested in the concrete and the interested in the abstract. This chapter, I think, is rather unambiguous about the importance of the concrete, just like chapter 35. But of course, there are other chapters in the book which will contradict that. As a reader, I think it's just a fun exploration of an interesting idea, which is where on the spectrum between the earthly and the spiritual are my interests. I know that for me, though I was somewhat, I won't say talented, I wasn't talented, but I was certainly sufficiently knowledgeable and skilled about science and math to consistently do well in rigorous courses. The interest in the concrete of the earthly never held my interest all that much. I was always interested in those spiritual or philosophical questions that this chapter is talking about. And I know people who are my very good friends who are completely the opposite, who are totally gifted at literature and philosophy and really had no interest in it. And I personally do not take as strong a stance as this chapter, but it's certainly an interesting, form of vocabulary or language with which to talk about the question of mankind's spiritual versus earthly concerns. All right. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in chapter 47.